certainly appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you Job chapters 38 through 41 in these next two lessons. When Brother Phil contacted me and asked if I would be willing to do this, I certainly was happy to do that and help the congregation there, but I did express some serious concerns about being able to cover in two 40-minute lessons the entire content of the four chapters in the book of Job that we are going to look at. But I'm going to condense it a great deal, as I have an entire gospel meeting on the science of Job, but we'll condense it down into two lessons as best I can. Job chapter 38 through 41, of course, follow as you've been studying all of the trials that Job has went through, all the advice that he had been given from his wife, his three friends, and all of his own questions. And Job certainly had a great deal of questions that he had about why these events were occurring, why they were happening to him, and of course, thinking as humans do, what had he done? And of course, that was part of his advice from his friends, was Job, repent of whatever you've done, and God will stop this punishment. And of course, the advice that Job's wife gave him to curse God and die, of course, was not appropriate either. So as we begin looking at these lessons, we see in chapter 38, verses 1 through 3, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. So God speaking to Job here for the first time to not necessarily explain what was going on to him through all of his, that caused all of his suffering, but to ask him what he knew about the world around him that would give him the authority to question God. And sometimes we as mortal humans need to be careful about our attitude towards the Creator and the realization that we know very little. And while we're many years beyond the period when Job lived, in many cases we're not much better off than Job was with his understanding of the world that God had created and the methods and the things that are used by God to control the earth we see and indeed the entire universe around us. So let's begin. After God now has introduced himself to Job and tells him, put on your big boy pants because I'm going to ask you some questions. In chapter 38, we see that Job is faced with several questions, and this sort of summarizes the areas in which Job was tested. God first starts out talking about the earth's structure and what Job knew about that, the oceans and the waves and the clouds and the cloud systems that covered the day-night cycle, which of course at the time of Job may not have been as well understood, the reasons for that as we know today. Then God asked Job about the springs of the sea and whether or not he had been able to search out the depths of the ocean, the treasures in the ice and snow and hail, the water cycle and the production of lightning. And then God finishes up in the end of chapter 38 with asking Job about the ordinance of heaven, the laws that run the universe. And certainly those are areas that we're still struggling to grasp today. So we're going to look at just a few of these in just very brief time period. We're not going to spend a lot of time on any one of them, even though all of them we can study the science of all of these for a considerable time period. And I did teach here at Billington an entire Bible class lesson, 1 quarter, 13 lessons on the science of Job, and still had plenty to say whenever we finished. So we'll move ahead and cover as quickly as we can some science questions that God asked Job and look at a little bit of the science behind them that we understand today that maybe Job didn't, but still leaving us in the same situation that Job was in as being people that who lack knowledge, where we have to be careful about the words we choose when we address God and when we address the Creator as the one who will be our judge. So let's begin in verses 4 through 6. God asked Job, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou have understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? And who laid the cornerstone thereof?" And so God here asks Job about the earth itself, about the structure that forms the earth. And of course, the earth is obviously we can look out and see around us on the ground. We can see the majesty of the mountains. And as you get out into the area of the Midwest, near where you folks are located, you can look out at the vast plains for areas for planting corn and wheat and other agricultural products. But when we look at the earth as a whole, when we look at the earth as an entire structure, we certainly see that it is extremely large. And even today, the study of earth science, the study of the geology of the earth itself, is an area that is constantly being revised, that is constantly being updated as we're learning more and more and more. And many times the hypothesis, the theories that scientists have had about the structure of the earth have proven to be entirely wrong. And even to the point that when we look at, sometimes the earth is called the water planet, but when we look at the surface water, there's very little water on the surface of the earth. And in recent years, geologists now believe they have figured out that below the subsurface, below the lower parts of the earth, are vast stores of water, maybe as much as 4 times as great as what we see on the surface. And so there are vast oceans even underneath the earth, and that harkens back to the fountains of the great deep in the story of the account of the Genesis flood, and the fact that subterranean water burst forth from the ground and of course helped to inundate the earth and to cover the highest mountains at the time of the flood, to destroy everyone who was not in the ark. And so we see that the structure of the earth is incredibly interesting, and we're still just scratching the surface, as it were, of the surface of the earth. And then, of course, God asked Job in verse 6, "Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened?" What is holding the earth? Of course, for many years, man thought that, well, maybe the earth is supported on the Atlas, on the shoulder of a giant man. The Far East cultures believe that the earth sat on the back of a giant turtle. That's what held it up in space. And as the turtle swam, that was the reason for the movement of the stars that could be observed every night in the nighttime sky. But certainly, what is holding up? What is fastening? What is at the center of the earth? And of course, we know that it's a very active place. We only have to look at the number of earthquakes and the number of tectonic shifts that are going on. Now, I don't believe that that was always the case. I believe that in the beginning, up until the time of the flood, the earth was a perfect paradise. It did not have any of these problems, and probably all the land masses were fit together, and there was no earthquakes, no natural disasters. But of course, sin entered the world, and as sin entered the world, then God had to destroy the earth that then was. And Peter said that the world that then was perished, being overflowed with water in 2 Peter. And so we see the question about what fastens the earth, what holds it down, is still unknown today. Well, we see in verse 8 of Job chapter 38, or who shut up the sea with doors, when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud, the garment thereof, and thick darkness is a swaddling band for it. And so we see God changes his direction, focuses Job on the ocean itself. And of course, we know that the ocean system that we see with the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, etc., is a very complex place. This particular slide shows the ocean currents, and you may not be able to see them all, but I would certainly encourage you to Google this and look at it. And these are just the surface currents. And of course, we know that here in the Atlantic Ocean, we have what's called the North Atlantic Gyre, which simply means that the water goes around and around, and so that the water that goes is in England today might make its way back to the coast of Florida in the United States, traveling up the east coast of the United States in a matter of several months. And so we can see that this is an extremely complex system. And who's controlling all this? Who put all this in motion? And of course, all of these systems are very important for the life that's in the ocean and for the feeding of mankind, us being able to use the resources. And of course, this is just the surface layer. There are below the surface layers many other layers of currents that move in many cases in different directions. So an upper layer will be moving south to north, and a subcurrent layer or a sub-ocean layer would be moving in another direction. And then, of course, there are layers called haloclines, where the salt differences, the salt content of the ocean changes, and thermoclines, temperature differences. And those are so important that a whale, a humpback whale, in one of those thermoclines, if he is singing one of his songs as God created him with the ability to do, that sound will bounce off of those thermoclines and travel for tens of thousands of miles as it makes its way, as that particular layer goes from one side of the ocean to the other. And so God asked Job, did you do this? Did you even understand it? Of course, Job, if he was aware, looking at the oceans, he obviously knew what the ocean was. We don't know where Job lived, and we don't even know at the time of his existence. But I believe he was one of the earliest patriarchs, and this may be the oldest book in the Bible, but that's a matter of opinion and not a matter of science. And so we see that God also asked Job, did you put the swaddling garment on the earth? And of course, we know that there's a vastly complex system of clouds that are present on the surface of the earth. And of course, those have great impact on humans and on the people living on the earth today. And so God wants to know from Job, if you think you have an understanding of all these things, and you want to know what my answers are for why the suffering is occurring, then sort of Job's being put in his place, as are we. We should be humbled by what God did, and to bring it into existence in 6 24-hour days is nothing short of amazing. Well, in verse 12 and 13 of chapter 38, God continues, "Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place, that it might take hold of the earth's into the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it." And so God asked Job, what about the explanation for how the day and night cycle? Of course, we understand today the earth turning on its axis revolves in a 24-hour time period, the sun being in a fixed position relative to the earth as the earth turns. Of course, that produces daylight on one side and nighttime on the other side. And of course, the revolution of the earth 7 times equals a week, which the only reason a week exists doesn't have anything to do with science. It has to do with the 7 24-hour periods that God used in Genesis chapter 1 to bring the earth into existence, or the universe into existence. And then of course the earth rotates around the sun in 365 days, giving us one calendar year, and then we come back to the same position. So God is asking Job, did you create this? Did you make this happen? Did you command the morning? Do you bring the sun up? We're, as humans, just considerably impressed every morning. We should be when we wake up and see the dawn of a new day. And of course, the fact that the earth tilts 23.5 degrees on its axis is very important as well, because that gives us the seasonal climate that we are so familiar with. The fact that we have summer, winter, spring, fall. Of course, the closer you go to the equator, the more constant the temperatures. You go to the northern and the southern poles, of course you find that, as we know, there is great long periods of darkness and long periods of light, and extremely cold temperatures, the coldest temperatures that we see on the planet, but yet there is many, many millions of forms of life that exist even in those difficult climates. Well, let's move on then with the science lesson for Job in verse 16. God asked Job, hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in search of the depth? And this particular question that God asked Job was one that would have stumped mankind up until about 30-some years ago. What was God talking about? I can imagine Job scratching his head and saying, what are you talking about? The springs of the sea. Now, we don't know what Job's intelligence was, but we can be pretty sure that he did not have, as a human, the ability to descend to the bottom of the ocean and to there observe geothermal vents that have been found at the bottom of the ocean. These geothermal vents are literally springs, and you can see the columns of, looks like smoke. Of course, it's actually water that is carrying a heavy load of dissolved minerals and sediment from deep down in the crust of the earth. It's been superheated and flows up out of those springs of the sea to the surface. Well, the location of these hydrothermal vents, as we've discovered them over the last 30 years, and again, these were literally unknown until we developed the technology, the equipment to allow us to get down to those locations. The stars represent the locations of these geothermal vents around the globe, and they always follow the plate structures, the places where two continental masses run up against one another, and this is where water can penetrate down in and come back up. Well, around these geothermal vents, scientists have been shocked to find that indeed there is life there that no one would have ever expected. When God said, hast thou walked in search of the depth? He's asking Job, have you been able to go down to the bottom of the ocean? Have you been able to walk across the bottom of the ocean and to see what I created down there? The life forms around these geothermal vents, or the springs of the sea, as God asked Job, is nothing short of amazing. The life that lives there is built on a completely different biochemical system than the life that we're familiar with here on Earth, with photosynthesis, producing sugar, animals eating sugar and releasing carbon dioxide and water, and water, and producing for plants what they need to be able to survive. The giant tube worms, as you can see here on the one side, those are about 6 feet long, so the scale doesn't really do a very good job. But the geothermal worms, the giant tube worms that live there, feed on, well, they don't actually eat anything. They don't have a digestive system. They don't have a stomach. I was able to actually observe one up close at the Smithsonian Institute, the Natural History Museum, when I was able to visit behind the scenes, and one of their biologists showed me one of the giant tube worms and explained how it feeds. It has bacteria that eat sulfur that is in the water that comes up out of these geothermal vents, and that's how they survive. They get their nutrients as waste products coming from the bacteria, and it appears this entire entire ecosystem is constructed in that manner. And so when we see the geothermal vents and God asking Job, have you entered these springs? Have you been down there? Of course, God is everywhere, and that's what we need to realize as humans, that there's nothing that God doesn't understand. There's nothing that God doesn't, of course, as the Creator. He knows every hair on our head. He knows every organism that is present on the planet. And so his understanding of this biochemical cycle that is not based on photosynthesis, but actually something called chemosynthesis, using a chemical in order to produce life. And so God would understand that, and if he chose at this time, he could walk at the bottom of the ocean. Of course, we know that he knows, from his location in heaven. Of course, God's everywhere, and so his understanding of that is so much greater than what humans would be, and certainly what Job, and indeed what we may today know more than Job about the springs of the sea. And we may know more about the depths of the ocean than Job did. We are still so ignorant about the things that are there. It has been said that we know more about the surface of the moon, 269,000 miles away, than we know about the depths of the sea, and that's exactly right. If we drained the oceans, we would be utterly, if we could drain the oceans, we would be utterly amazed at what we would find there. And so God's questioning Job about the geothermal vents, about the springs of the sea, and so walking in the search of the depths thereof, certainly put Job again back into his place, back into a situation where, of course, he would be humbled just as we should be humbled by the knowledge and the power and the wisdom that God had when he created this entire planet that we live on, with all the organisms and all the interactive biochemical functions going on, but of course the entire universe, as we'll see in a little bit. Well, in verses 28 through 30, God says to Job, "Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven? Who hath gathered it? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen." And so God now moves to sort of change part of the earth cycle, part of the earth science field, and God brings to Job what we now know as, bring to Job's attention what we now know as the water cycle. And of course, this water cycle is what keeps humans alive today. This is what keeps the planet, this is what keeps the universe functioning, because without that evaporation of the water, of course it's all based on the thermal energy from the sun at the equator. Again, one of the reasons why the Earth's 23.5-degree tilt is so important to us is because at the equator, the constant warm temperatures helps to evaporate the water, which goes back up into the atmosphere, which then moves north and south and helps to produce in condensation, helps to produce rain, of course, which we here in West Virginia now have been praying for significant rain, as we're in a drought condition that's lasted for the longest drought for 133 years. And very probably you folks in Springfield are experiencing some of that as well. But that evaporation, that condensation, and that falling of rain and snow in the mountains, of course here in the mountains we get rain that maybe you wouldn't get in Ohio, because as the water is uplifted, as the clouds are uplifted, that garment that God wrapped the earth in, back in the earlier question that God asked, that cools those clouds, and precipitation falls, snow, rain, and of course even hail. And so we see that there are conditions going on in this water cycle that without the water cycle and God's establishment of it, the water stored in the ocean, the evaporation, the condensation, of course there's a great deal of water in the atmosphere. Driving in today, passed through several areas of very dense fog. Fog so dense that a couple times needing to turn on windshield wipers, and you have all experienced that as well. There's a great deal of water in the clouds, and of course that water cycle. And of course then the rain, snow feeds back down in to charge the aquifers, the lower layers, the water that saturates down into the ground. And of course many people who drill water wells, farms that drill water wells down into the ground to pump water out. And of course the water that runs off the land goes into the rivers and of course makes its way back to the ocean. And many cities, towns, many of the people in the United States, including here in Belington, use the water that's running through those rivers. And even in these drought conditions, that's a problem because the water levels in the rivers have reached all-time lows. And so it puts the burden of trying to provide enough water for people today in this drought condition. So this water cycle is extremely important. Well, then God asked about the way of lightnings of thunder. And of course, we know that lightning is one of the most amazing geophenomenal structure or events that we know of. And if you are not in awe of a thunderstorm, that lightning, of course, you don't have thunder without lightning. The thunder is produced by the superheating of the air from the discharge of that electrical charge from the earth to the ground, from the clouds to the earth, or from the clouds to the clouds. That certainly then superheated air produces that clap, that noise, that clap of thunder. And of course then that reverberates for miles and miles and miles and miles. As well as from my location here in West Virginia on top of one of the mountains, I can see lightning, I can see the light from a lightning bolt 70, 80, 100 miles away in the night sky. It can be perfectly clear where I am, but maybe to the far north or the far south, I can see the light produced by. And of course, there's a geometrical progression. If you see the light from a lightning bolt, and then you count the number of seconds, you can pretty accurately approximate the location of how far away that storm is, how far away that thunderstorm is. And of course, the production of lightning really is no more complex than walking in your sock feet across the carpet and reaching up and touching a light panel or a light switch or something metallic. And you get this, or another person for that matter, getting this little spark of electricity. That is a baby lightning bolt. That's a baby spark, a very small one, but that indeed is the same situation that God has used to create lightning. It's the movement of clouds across the land masses, that garment that God created, and as it passes over the ground, you get negatively charged electrons in the atmosphere, you get positively charged in the ground or on the ground or by all the structures on the ground. And then when that static builds up too greatly, then you get a discharge between the cloud and the ground, or between two clouds. There is cloud-to-cloud lightning and cloud-to-ground lightning. And of course, and it's a very real danger. Just the other day, I heard the story of two hunters out in New Mexico that disappeared, and they were found deceased several days later, and the coroner's report said that they had been killed by a lightning strike. And so it's a very dangerous situation, and certainly we need to respect the power. Of course, if we were able to catch one lightning bolt, that would solve all of our electrical needs for generating electricity here in the United States, because one lightning bolt would run the entire state of West Virginia for several months, and that's just one lightning bolt. And we get millions of them around the globe, and of course they do occur in areas that, in Florida, for example, Lightning Alley, we have Tornado Alley in the Midwest, but we also have Lightning Alley, places where lightning is more likely to form due to the atmospheric conditions that are present in those particular areas. And so the way of lightning and thunder, certainly for us as humans, we would love to be able to control, to catch that energy that's present in those lightning bolts, to be able to use, and maybe someday we will. It's just a matter of figuring out the technology. We know how to produce lightning. They will shoot a model rocket carrying a copper wire up into a thunderstorm, and they can actually produce lightning bolts. They give a method for the charges in the clouds to discharge down into the opposite pole on the ground, and lightning will follow that copper wire right down to the ground structure. And they use this, several major universities use this in order to study how to control our structures, our houses, our equipment, and how they even keep us safe in lightning-prone areas. And of course, there are very few places in the world where lightning doesn't occur. We do have to be careful as well. You can see a lightning bolt coming off to the side here. They of course have found that we have to be very careful. Within 10 miles of a thunderstorm, lightning can travel laterally and then come down to the ground. And those are called a bolt from the blue, and they are very dangerous. And so we see sports team, athletic teams, competitions, Little League baseball teams. If there's a storm within 10 miles that's producing lightning, they will cancel the game, get everybody off of the baseball field, because it's extremely dangerous. When I was younger, there was a Little League baseball game out in the Eastern Panhandle, West Virginia. Did not get called off soon enough. That's been 45 years ago. And the pitcher, the young man standing on the mound out in the center of the field, was struck by lightning. The lightning came right through the top of his baseball cap, the little metal button on top, and he was killed. But all the players in the infield all suffered some significant injuries from that lightning bolt. So we certainly need to, and we need to appreciate the majesty and the power that lightning shows, but stop and realize that lightning thunder is only one very small portion of what power that God has. And it should humble us just as Job was humbled. And we have to be careful not to ask questions that we have no business asking, and that we have to respect God's majesty and what He has done. Well, then of course the treasures of the snow. I don't know what Job knew about snow at the time of God giving him these questions, but we can see with modern technology today that snowflakes, and the statement is made that no two snowflakes are the same. I don't know that that's the case, because sometimes when we get 15, 18, 24 inches of snow here in West Virginia in the mountains, or even in many places, the Sierra Nevadas in the West Coast, they'll get 4 and 5 feet of snow. Whether those billions and billions and trillions of snowflakes, whether there are two that are alike, but certainly we can see that the formation of snowflakes and the patterns, the geometric patterns of these ice crystals, and these are just frozen water droplets that are frozen and then fall, and depending on the conditions in which they form, produces these different types of snowflakes. And it also makes a difference on how slick the snow is. We know that some snow does appear slicker than others. Formation of snow, there are actually charts that talk about what kind of conditions will produce what kind of snow, and the amount of water vapor. On the one axis we have the supersaturation level, the amount of water that's present, and then across the bottom we have the temperature. So warmer temperatures produce different types of snowflakes than colder temperatures. And so we have to understand that formation of snow and the treasures therein are in God's control. You can imagine God controlling each individual snowflake's formation. God could do that. Of all the snow in the entire, from the Himalayas to here in West Virginia, God could control every snowflake if he chose to. The formation of each individual snowflake, just like he can count the number of hairs on our head. Well, we need to move on. Of course, the treasures. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the hail? Now, many times we don't consider them treasures whenever they're busting out our windows in our cars, or denting them, or breaking the windows in our homes and doing vast amounts of damage, because hail can grow to extremely large sizes, even as big as grapefruit. Hail is produced by a thunderstorm and the uplift of moisture, water from the ground coming up into the cloud, and it's called an updraft, and going up into the clouds, and the more times it's either raised and lowered, as it goes down, it picks up water. As it goes back up, it freezes. As it comes back down below the freezing level, it picks up, and back and forth it goes, and that until finally that hailstone is too heavy for the storm to maintain, and it falls down. And so the large size of hail, the hail of large sizes would produce by extremely intense thunderstorms. Able to pick those hailstones, put them very high, and we can see that the layers, you can see the layers in the hailstones, and those, of course, how many times it went up and down below the freeze line in the thunderstorm that produced it. So very large thunderstorms produce hail of very large sizes. The hoary frost, if you've ever seen hoary frost, it is an incredible structure. It almost just ice crystals sticking to everything. Doesn't form very often. Takes very unique situations for hoary frost to form, but certainly that does occur. And of course, God would understand exactly what it takes to do that. The waters are hidden with a stone. We see here the North Pole, the northern regions of the world. A polar bear walking across a layer of ice. Of course, below him is the Arctic, the Arctic Ocean, and that ice is maybe 5-6 feet thick or more. And so the waters are hid as with a stone. And certainly, if you've ever been under an icicle on the hanging off the house when it fell, you realize how dangerous that can be. Well, let's move on to the final section that we're going to have time to look at today in the last few minutes, in verses 31 through 33. Canst thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Hast thou brought forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? And so we see that the Pleiades, if you're familiar with the night sky, you can look up and see what we call the seven sisters. A group of stars, 7 of them, and those are the Pleiades. God identified for Job the name of that particular group of stars. The bands of Orion, Orion the hunter, as the ancient Greeks looked at the night sky. And the bands of Orion refer to these 3 stars here that make up the belt of Orion. Orion the hunter, they considered him. And so, did Job have the ability to take that belt off, just like we would have a belt that we wear around our waist today? And certainly we know that Job could not. Well, then God asked, knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? There are known to man right now 12 laws that run the universe. And we're talking about run the universe so precisely that if any one of these 12 laws is just a little bit off, then the whole universe dissolves into nothingness. And so God asked Job, as we finish up here, if he understood these 12 laws. Well, I got news for you. We still are struggling to understand and answer. The James Webb Space Telescope is upending the science of astronomy, study of the universe, because it's revealing questions or revealing answers that we thought we understood and, of course, have not. And so the question that I would have today, could you or I pass the science test that God gave Job? And the answer is a resounding no. And so I would encourage you to read all of chapter 38 carefully. Didn't talk about many of the things that are contained therein. And I appreciate your time and being with us for this information today.